Starting off at number 10 now, we have berserkers. These guys are where the word berserk literally comes from, and for good reason. They were fierce Viking warriors who worked themselves up into an uncontrollable trance-like frenzy and made people believe they were invincible before a battle. Whether or not that was actually true, it was said to be enough for them to not only perform superhuman feats of strength, but also scare their enemies into submission. Stories describe them as screaming, red-faced, and even howling. Before the battle, they would actually bite at their own shields and skin. They didn't even feel the pain apparently because of the state they were in. Why was this? Well, it's thought they worked themselves up into this sort of hysteria, but others have suggested it could have been drugs, alcohol, a mental disorder, or even sorcery. Whatever it was, their enemies would always be running the opposite way. Next up at number 9 now, we have child sacrifices. It's well known that a lot of ancient cultures, including the Vikings, sacrificed animals as part of their religious rituals. However, a study in 2015 seemed to confirm the rumours that it wasn't just animals that were being killed. At the Viking fortress of Trelleborg in Sweden, archaeologists found human and animal skeletons in 5 water wells, together with jewellery and tools. They believe the human remains were due to human sacrifice. That wasn't enough, they also found that 4 out of 5 of them were actually young children aged between 4 and 7. It's thought they were killed and thrown into the well due to the importance of wells in Viking culture. Now they believe that the god Odin gained wisdom from drinking at Mimir's well. In exchange, he had to sacrifice one of his own eyes. As such, these Vikings must have thought that sacrificing a whole human to a well would have brought untold gifts from the gods. Perhaps even more so if the victim was a child. Moving on to number 8 now, we have slavery. For many years, the topic of Viking slavery was often glossed over or downplayed. Recently though, studies have suggested that not only did the Vikings keep slaves, they were ingrained into their very way of life. They had a slave economy. This wasn't anything new to Scandinavia as a whole. There is evidence of it dating back to the 1st century before the Vikings. The Vikings did it on a much bigger scale though. Writings describe the slave trade in the 10th century as extending across the Mediterranean from Spain to Egypt. Others recorded that slaves were brought to the Viking homelands from as far away as Russia, Turkey, and Persia. Over the years, there have been a number of theories about why the Vikings had such a need for these slaves. Some say it was to produce textiles for their sails, to sacrifice the slaves to their gods, or in the case of female slaves, to make up for a lack of eligible women in the Viking homelands. Next up at number 7 now, we have Holmgang. That's the name of this dangerous Viking duel that was used to settle honor disputes. It started with a challenge. If someone felt that they had been personally dishonored, they had 3 to 7 days to issue a challenge to that person. The person who had been called out then had to show up on the given day for the duel. If they didn't, they brought shame on their entire clan. The name Holmgang can be translated as to go to a small island. That's because the duel would normally take place on a cloak or piece of fabric placed on the ground to sort of mark out the area. In the old Holmgangs, it was not uncommon for one of the fighters to be killed in combat. Because the person was killed during a Holmgang, no murder charges would ever be brought about. The matter was just considered settled. Can you guys imagine if we sort of lived like that today? I think there would be a lot of Holmgangs kicking off every single day. Moving on to number 6 now, we have the teeth. Some Vikings used to file their teeth. There's an interesting phrase for you. A Swedish anthropologist analysed 557 Viking skeletons dating from the year 800 to about 1050 and found that 24 of them had deep horizontal grooves along their upper front teeth. This would have given them a pretty scary look by today's standards. In fact, it's thought that the Vikings may have done this intentionally in order to scare their enemies. The largest amount of examples of this practice was found at a Viking cemetery on Gotland. Most of them had neat parallel marks on their 2 upper front teeth, which may originally have had charcoal or other colouring rubbed in to add to the whole look. Either way, they would have looked just that extra bit more terrifying to their enemies, which may have been the tiny advantage they needed in battle. Next up at number 5 now, we have the Blood Eagle. This was a brutal form of execution deployed by the Vikings on those who wronged them, even within their own communities. It involved an individual being placed in a prone position. Their ribs would then be severed from their spine with a sharp tool, and and their lungs pulled through the opening to create a pair of wings. The earliest account of this gruesome execution method comes from the year 867. It described how King Aela of Northumbria in England was attacked by Viking raiders led by Ragnar Lothbrok. When Ragnar was defeated, Aela threw him into a pit of live snakes that killed him. Now in revenge, Ragnar's sons sailed to England and took the city of York. They then captured Aela and decided to perform the Blood Eagle on him. A gruesome death for a gruesome death. Moving on to number 4 now, we have the Draugr. I think these may be some of the creepiest but coolest parts of Viking culture. For me, the Draugr is an undead creature from Norse mythology. The Vikings believe that a Draugr is created when a corpse is not left in a horizontal position but is found upright, indicating that the dead might return. They also tend to be created from people who were mean, nasty, or greedy in life. Once reanimated, the Draugr would wait in their graves, often guarding vast amounts of treasure in their burial mounds. If a grave robber came to steal that treasure, they'd have to fight the Draugr first. They are said to possess superhuman strength and can increase in size at will. One account describes a Draugr as being swollen to the size of an ox. They were said to slay their victims through crushing, driving them insane, or simply devouring them whole and then drinking their blood. Some lovely options there. Nice variety. Next up at number 3 now, we have infanticide. There is an emerging theory among historians that the Viking Age, as we know it, was caused by the ritual killing of newborn babies, otherwise known as infanticide. If that sounds crazy, let me explain. Like many ancient cultures, the Vikings were thought to have selectively killed newborns for religious rituals, particularly females. The theory goes that this would have led to a shortage of women within Viking society. They then would have been driven to sail to new lands on a sort of marriage imperative, hoping to find a partner that just wasn't available in their homeland. Of course, this is just a far-flung theory. The real reason is probably much more complex, but the infanticide aspect seems to be a very real part of Viking culture. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the soup. As you've probably already gathered so far, the Vikings loved to fight. A lot of them were often injured on the battlefield and tended to by Viking women. Sometimes there were many men to treat and not enough healers or resources to go around. So they came up with a system that involved a soup. The soup was made with garlic, leeks and herbs, very fragrant, and they would be given to the men to eat. After a few minutes they would then lean in and smell the stomach of the warrior. If they could smell the soup, then the wound had pierced their stomach and they were doomed. There was not much they could do for them. They would then be made comfortable but ultimately left to their own fate, while the healers would move on to try and save someone else. Can you guys imagine how nerve-wracking it would be if they were about to treat you and then they smelt the soup? And finally at number 1 now, we have the games. Games should be fun. That's why many of you will find the Viking concept of games to be quite strange, I think. There are writings that describe some brutal competitions that Vikings took part in just for fun. One of these was a swimming competition, or rather a drowning competition. The entire object of the game was to hold your opponent down underwater and see how long they could hold their breath for. If they couldn't get up out of the water, well, then there's a good chance they'd just die. There was also one case of 2 boys who played this game. One of them lost but survived. He was actually so upset, however, that later in the day he smashed an axe into the back of the other boy's head. He was 6 years old. Fun games aren't always fun.
Starting off this countdown, we have Berserker. Between the 8th to mid 11th century, the Vikings were known to be very aggressive. In fact, when they were at battle, they would go into this trance-like state that was called Berserker. Once in this state, they would violently kill anyone who got in their way. Well, theory goes that this state was actually caused by eating magic mushrooms. Apparently, the mushrooms that grew in their area would cause hallucinations and would also increase their adrenaline levels, hence why they act so violently and out of control. Like nowadays, people do shrooms and just chill out and watch Dora the Explorer. Imagine doing a whole battle while tripping out. In our 9th spot, we have the burning bodies. But before I go any further, make sure to give this video a big thumbs up because it really helped us out. In Norse religion, after death, it was said that warriors went into these great realms. But in order to get there, they needed a vessel. So when someone died back then, Vikings would place their body on a boat and push them off to sea. These boats were often surrounded by weapons and goods, even sometimes human sacrifices, all to help them get to their end destination. Not only that, but the more wealthy Vikings would actually burn the boat with the deceased on them and then push them out to sea. That's a pretty creepy image if you ask me, just watching a flaming dead body. Or bodies. In our 8th spot, we have the imbalance. Turns out that the Vikings were killing off so many women that they started having an uneven gender ratio. This was because men were considered stronger than women. Also because the Norse values sons more than daughters. Over the years, archaeologists found tons of young female skeletons, so it was believed that they would get rid of them when they were young. Coming in at number 7, we have the teeth. Back in the day, Vikings would painfully file and dye their teeth. Archaeologists recently unearthed evidence of this. Basically, they would file their teeth down. Some would file horizontal parallel lines in their front 2 teeth, and some even dyed them. Often red. Yeah, not white, red. And then the dye would seep into the carvings and stand out. Doesn't this kind of remind you of something? Yeah, everything is coming full circle. Remember that whole trend on TikTok of people filing down their own teeth by themselves? Wow. Now the purpose of this filing remains unclear, but some think it may have to do with their status as a great fighter. Other people believe that it was done to scare off their enemies. In our 6th spot, we have the bloody soup. This was a practice that women would use when caring for an injured Viking. It was used to gauge how bad their flesh wounds were. So basically, they would make a broth out of onions, leeks, and herbs. Then they would feed this to the injured Viking. After he finished eating it, they would then smell the wound. Yes, smell the wound. If they could smell the soup, then they knew the wound was way too deep and there was no sense helping the warrior. They would just die soon anyways. But if there was no smell, then good on them. The dude was good and they would actually treat them. Isn't that insane? Imagine if hospitals made us do that, like down a crap ton of onions and then sniff us. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the blood tasting. This is another really weird practice that the Vikings would do. So basically, women would use the blood of a wound to figure out more about the injury. They would do this by tasting the blood. I mean, there's not much information on this practice, but still, it's quite gross, but also kind of fascinating. Like, how could they tell the difference between a fatal wound and a non-fatal wound just by tasting someone's blood? Totally blows my mind. Again, thankfully this isn't a practice doctors and nurses use today. Moving on at number 4, we have an eye for an eye. The Vikings had a pretty messed up justice system. Thank gosh, it's not like this still. But basically, killing someone wasn't always illegal. For example, they believed in an eye for an eye. So if someone, let's say, killed your wife, you could then kill the murderer. But then it would get complicated because then the murderer's family could kill you and then it would just be this like perpetual killing cycle. They also had a thing called home gangs, which was a way of settling disputes. Basically, these were fights to the death. If one person did you wrong, you could ask them to a duel. If the person who was challenged doesn't show up, then they were deemed guilty, and anyone was allowed to kill that person. Again, I'm glad this isn't a thing anymore. In our 3rd spot, we have the games. Obviously, they weren't playing jump rope or hopscotch for fun. No, they had some pretty dark games, like a swimming competition, except you're not swimming. In fact, you would hold your opponent underwater for as long as you could. If the man didn't resurface, then you won, and the dude died. So basically they were playing murder. Moving on to number 2, we have the human sacrifices. For a number of years, scientists believed Vikings did not partake in human sacrifice. That was until 1990 when an archaeologist made a quite interesting discovery. While using a metal detector, the archaeologist found jewelry and weapons along the edge of a lake. He kept digging and eventually came across evidence of human sacrifice that dated back to the Viking Age. Then in the 1930s, a series of ancient wells were excavated. That's when they found bone remnants of 5 people. Again, suggesting this. According to Vikings, sacrifices helped re-establish their connection to the gods, and they would only do this when things were going bad for them. And in our number 1 spot, we have the blood eagle. Now this one is fairly graphic. Blood eagle is a method of ritual execution. Basically, the victim would be restrained, their face down. Then the shape of an eagle with its wings out would be carved into their back. And then their ribs would be cut off, one by one. Finally, they would take the skin and pull it apart to make it look like a pair of wings. Ever seen the show Hannibal? It reminds me of that one episode from season 1. If you know, you know. But it gets worse. You would still be alive while all of this happened. And then a saline solution would be poured all over your body. Okay, I can barely take hand sanitizer in a paper cut. So that would be brutal. The last step was taking the victim's lungs and spreading them over the wings. Starting off this countdown, we have the swords. The Vikings were armed with a number of weapons, like long axes and spears. But the weapon they liked the most were their long swords. These swords would then be passed down from generation to generation. Before passing their sword down to their son, they would share stories of who they killed with their sword and what battle was like. In fact, they were so protective of their swords that they would always carry them on their backs, and they would sleep with them beside them, because you had to be armed and ready at all times. Now, I think the creepiest part of this whole thing is that they would give their swords disturbing names, like calling them the Widowmaker or the Corpse Bramble, so on and so on. That is pretty messed up if you ask me. In our ninth spot, we have the cremation ceremony. And if you guys like this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up because it really helps us out. Okay, this next point is extremely messed up. So after the death of a chief, they had this really weird cremation ceremony for him, which involved a number of dark things. So after the chief died, his body was left in a grave for 10 days. During those 10 days, new clothes were being made for him. Then one of his slave girls were selected to join him in the afterlife, meaning they would kill her. So on that day, the girl was given a number of drinks to intoxicate her. Then she had to get it on with every man in the village. After that, she was strangled to death while being stabbed in the ribs. When she was dead, she was placed alongside the chief on a ship. They did this so that the chief would have someone to serve him in the afterlife. And then the boat containing the two were set on fire and pushed out to sea. Moving on at number 8, we have the sacrifices. Apparently every 9 years, 81 people were sacrificed during Yule. Yule was thought to have happened on January 12th and was celebrated to either honor the dead or get good luck in the new year, to celebrate the sun and light, or to honor Thor. We don't know for sure, but those are just some possibilities. This was celebrated for 9 days. Each day, 9 heads would be offered to the gods, meaning in the end, there would be 81 people sacrificed for the gods. Their bodies were hung by the temples. So that's absolutely horrifying. Coming in at number 7, we have Eric the Red. So the Vikings were known for their brutal killings. I mean, they were pretty violent. But there was one dude that was way too violent to be a Viking. Imagine that. This guy's name was Eric the Red. He was given that name due to his red hair and red beard, and because of his tendency to kill. He had a nasty, nasty temper. In 980, Eric's servant caused a landslide that destroyed his neighbor's house. So the servant was killed, and this infuriated Eric, who then killed his servant's killer and another member of his clan. In the end, this got him banished, so he moved. And this time, he was living more north in Iceland. But while living there, he got into another fight with a different neighbor. Eric went on to kill this neighbor as well. As a result, he was banished again. So this guy just had a life of conflict and killing. Moving on at number 6, we have the odd pets. Nowadays we have hamsters, birds, fish, and dogs and cats as household pets. Well, back in the day, it was kind of the same. The Vikings enjoyed having pets. They had cats and dogs, but also falcons, peacocks, and bears. Oh my. They would have bears as pets. So they would go around trapping bear cubs and then would raise them as members of their family. Typically it would be brown bears, but some even had polar bears. But polar bears were meant mainly for noblemen. Here's the thing though, If their bear ever got loose and injured someone, well, the owner would have to pay the price, either by death or they would be banished. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the repurposing. I don't know how else to name this, and you'll see why. So it turns out that the Vikings were quite resourceful. I mean, they managed to find a way to turn their own urine into fire. Don't know how they discovered this or why they tried to experiment with their urine, but they did. So basically, they would boil touchwood, which was a tree bark fungus, and they would boil it in a pot of urine. They did this for days, and I can only imagine how bad that must have smelt. Anyways, when that was done, they would take the bark and pound it into a strip of felt-like material. Again, who came up with this idea? Like, oh, I'm just gonna pee and then take some bark, put it in, boil, and who came up with this? Anyway, because of the sodium nitrate in urine, these strips would smolder rather than burn. So they would just carry around these little urine strips and start a fire wherever they went. How resourceful. Seriously, who the hell thought of that? I don't know. Moving on to number 4, we have the battle rituals. Viking warriors were actually pretty superstitious when it came to their battles. As a result, they had a special ritual they would perform before their battles. First off, each of their weapons were marked with different symbols. These symbols represented things like strength, luck, and courage. They also were very cautious. Days leading up to the battle, they would look out for any omens. If they thought they found a bad omen, they would do what they could to reverse it. And lastly, they would make battle sacrifices. They would sacrifice big, strong animals like boars, stallions, or bulls. I guess the thought was they are sacrificing their strength and in return are asking the gods for strength and support in battle. Moving on to number 3, we have the spirits. The Vikings believed that once they buried the dead, that they could come alive again, like zombies, and harm the townspeople. So they took several precautions to avoid this from ever happening. Number 1, they would tie the dead's big toes together, and nails were pressed into the soles of their feet. This was done so that if they woke up, they wouldn't be able to walk. When the dead person in the coffin was carried out of the house, the carriers would stop walking and make a shape of the cross with the coffin by lowering and raising it. Sometimes the person was carried out through a thing called a corpse door. Basically, it was a hole in the wall that they would make. They would then carry the dead through the hole and then patch it back up. They did this because they believed the dead could only return the same way that they came. But if the hole was patched up, they wouldn't be able to get back in that way. The body was also carried out feet first, so that the corpse couldn't see which route they were taking to get to their burial spot. And sometimes their entire head and eyes were just wrapped and covered as an extra precaution. And lastly, when the coffin was at the burial spot, they would have to turn over any items previously used by the dead person, like chairs, stools, mugs, etc. Again, this was all done with fear that they would come back from the dead. And at number 2, we have the Draugr. The Draugr is an undead creature from Norse mythology. It's basically a zombie. So it's said that this zombie creature was created if a corpse was not buried in a horizontal position, but they were left upright. Typically, people that were mean or greedy in their life would become these creatures. Once they came back to life, they would wait in their graves, surrounded by treasures. If a grave robber came to ransack them, well, they would have to go through the Draugr first. In fact, they were believed to have superhuman strength, and they were described as having a terrible decaying smell to them, and were hideous to look at. They would kill their victims by crushing them, devouring them, or driving them insane. This is what also led the Vikings to take such caution when burying the dead. They did not want them coming back to life as this zombie creature. And in our number 1 spot, we have the blot. The blot was another form of sacrifice for the gods. This was a blood sacrifice to show gratitude towards them, and it was performed publicly multiple times per year. When performing this sacrifice, animals were sliced over an altar of stones. The blood was then collected and passed around. But wait, it gets worse. As it was passed around, people took sips of the blood while chanting along. Then the body of the animal was passed around while the chanting continued. And finally, the animal was then saturated in its own blood. The bigger the animal that was sacrificed symbolized a higher level of gratitude towards the gods. Now, this ritual was said to happen 4 times or more per year. It was done for the winter solstice, spring equinox, summer solstice, and autumn equinox. Not only that, but if anything bad happened, like let's say they had a bad harvest, then they would do this ritual to call to the gods for help. Alright guys.